Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out, and welcome to Ream Library. If you're first-year students, welcome to Ream Library. If it's the first time in here, I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, and this is our home. The McFarland Center sponsors a range of conferences, programs, lectures, special events on campus that address questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. And one of the great things that we get to do is to coordinate with our Kraft Hyatt professor, Alan Avery Peck, the Kraft Hyatt program for Jewish-Christian understanding. We run a range of programs that explore modern and historic Judaism, Holocaust studies, and a range of issues related to Jewish life and Jewish-Christian understanding. And today's event is falls under that aegis. Today I'm really pleased to introduce Dan Okrent, the first public editor of the New York Times and a best-selling author of books of nonfiction. His 2011 book, Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition, was cited by the American Historical Association as the year's best book on American history. And Great Fortune, the Epic of Rockefeller Center, was a finalist for the 2004 Pulitzer Prize in History. His most recent book, which we're going to explore today, is called The Guarded Gate. It tells the story of how anti-immigration activists in the early 20th century, most of them well-born, many of them quote-unquote progressives by the standard of their time, used bogus science of eugenics to justify closing the immigration door to Jews, Italians, and other European immigrants. It's a delight to welcome Dan, and please join me.
Let me figure out my technology, and I'll be right with you. Hi, thank you for coming on this gorgeous day. We could all go outside if you'd like, but maybe not. Let me begin with a quotation. And as you'll discover as I go on, the history of anti-immigration movements in this country could fill a Bartlett's of illogic, imprudence, and invective. Philadelphia, 1753. A local newspaper editor, consumed by dislike of the Germans flooding into the Pennsylvania colony, writes, I'll do this whenever I'm quoting, I think, new immigrants are generally the most stupid sort of their own nation. Unless they are turned away, he added, they will soon so outnumber us that the English language itself will be imperiled. 1753, Pennsylvania. The writer, as you may have guessed, was Benjamin Franklin. If you're disappointed that such a robust advocate of democratic principles would express such a xenophobic attitude, you may have much to be disappointed by this afternoon. I promise, though, that there's a happy ending, or sort of a happy ending. The reality is that anti-immigrant rhetoric and anti-immigrant passion have been a staple of American life throughout our history. It usually goes in cycles, almost like a sine wave. At 1 minute, we're asking the world to give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free, and soon we're asking them, or ordering them in some instances, many instances, stay away. The first great wave of anti-immigrant feeling was directed at the Irish, who crossed the ocean in the wake of the Great Potato Famine. They provoked a political party, unsubtly called the American Party, but which soon became known even less subtly as the Know-Nothings, a term, in fact, that the party itself embraced. Whoops. This was a cartoon by the great Thomas Nast that was meant to indicate what the church was doing. These churchmen wearing their mitres are beasts of prey that were attacking the country, it was felt at the time. Motivated primarily by a hatred for the Catholic Church, called as one of the era's most famous grade school primers, the whore of Rome, the Know-Nothings elected 5 senators, 43 members of the House of Representatives, and 7 governors within a 6-year period. Then they disappeared, as such movements so often do. One key reason was the labor shortage caused by the Civil War. The targets of the next outbreak of extreme nativism were the Chinese. The Chinese came to America to build the railroads in the 1860s and 70s. So intense was the hatred, or if you prefer, fear, or we could agree both, so intense was the hatred and fear directed at the Chinese that for the first time in American history, Congress placed an anti-immigrant policy in the law books. The Chinese Exclusion Act, passed by Congress in 1882, slammed the door shut. Then came the largest migration in American history. From the desperately poor provinces of southern Italy, from the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe, under the thumb of a new set of anti-Semitic ordinances issued by the Tsar of Russia, and from most of the countries in between came a human tidal wave that would not abate until the most restrictive immigration law in American history was enacted in 1924. And that's why we're here today, to try to understand how it happened and what the consequences were. Excuse me for a moment. In the mid-1890s, just a few years after the new immigrant processing station was established at Ellis Island in New York Harbor, a powerful anti-immigration movement was launched by this man, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the most powerful man in the Senate for nearly 30 years, a sign of two very wealthy aristocratic Boston families. He was what was the first PhD in political science at Harvard. I look this painting by John Singer Sargent. I feel like I'm despoiling him by my very presence. I mean, the arrogance and presumption, I think, is obvious. He was a writer of great accomplishment, who then became a congressman and soon senator from Massachusetts. In Congress, he was among the New England stalwarts who fought passionately to give voting rights to the black men of the South. Swaddled in aristocratic privilege, when he entered politics, the local newspapers dismissed him as La-di-da Lodge and the silver spoon young man. He was Congress's most fervent advocate for the meritocracy of the civil service. He also saw the ruination of the U.S. and the ever more crowded streets of immigrant Boston. Lodge's solution was to pass legislation subjecting all new immigrants to a literacy test, aware as he was that levels of education in Southern and Eastern Europe, and poor communities especially, would keep out the lion's share of potential immigrants from those countries. Invoking the term of the day meant to describe differences in nationality, race, Lodge declared that race prejudice has long since ceased to be harmful, and it has had other effects which have been of very real value. And if a lower race mixes with a higher race in sufficient numbers, the lower race will prevail. And keep in mind, the term race, he's speaking of people who are not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Exclusively. Anybody else would be of a lower race by that measure. Making no effort at all to disguise his prejudices, Lodge told the Senate that a literacy test will bear most heavily upon the Italians, Russians, Poles, Hungarians, and Asiatics, and very lightly, or not at all, on English-speaking immigrants. The nations most affected, he continued, are those with which the English-speaking people have never hitherto assimilated and are alien to the great body of the people of the United States. When the debate reached the House, Representative Elijah Morse, also of Massachusetts, declared that many of the immigrants came to America equipped, and this too is a direct quote, with little else than an alimentary canal and an appetite. Lodge's bill was passed by both houses of Congress, the House by a vote of 217 to 36. But then, on the very last day of his presidency, Grover Cleveland vetoed it, citing longstanding national policy of mostly open doors. The literacy test, he said in his veto message, was merely a pretext for exclusion. But out of the bill's debate emerged an anti-immigration movement immeasurably larger and emerging from more influential quarters than any that had ever preceded it. Centered in Boston, the Immigration Restriction League enrolled in its membership the future Harvard president A. Lawrence Lowell and his siblings, many Adamses, the celebrated novelist Owen Wister, the great legal historian Charles Warren, the first director of the U.S. Census and then president of MIT, Francis Amasa Walker. Surveying the immigrant population of Boston, Walker once described them as vast masses of filth living like swine. The Brahmins who headed the movement, interestingly, they referred to themselves, their term at the time was Native Americans. They had allies in other quarters. Fearful of wage competition, the American labor movement itself stood firmly against any immigration at all. This despite the fact that the president of the AFL, who declared he never in his 40-year career agreed with Henry Cabot Lodge on anything else, was Samuel Gompers, himself an immigrant Jew from England. In fact, many of the German Jews who had arrived in the U.S. in the middle of the 19th century harbored prejudices even more intense. In the years that the new immigrants began pouring out of Russia, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, one of the major figures in the Reformed Judaism movement of the mid-19th century, had been very specific in defining the distinction between his kind of Jew from the German-speaking countries and this new sort from Eastern Europe. We are Americans, he said, and they are not. We are Israelites of the 19th century in a free country, and they gnaw the bones of past centuries. One would not think that this man would have agreed with that. Edward Ellsworth Ross was perhaps America's most distinguished sociologist. Dedicated to freedom of thought, he had been instrumental in founding the American Association of University Professors and the tenure system that the organization had brought into being. Fired from Stanford for political heresy, namely for denigrating the railroad barons who had, among other things, founded Stanford, Ross settled at the University of Wisconsin, where he affiliated himself with the growing progressive movement led by Robert La Follette. Later in life, Ross became board chairman of the American Civil Liberties Union. But during the rise of this movement, the movement that Lodge had initiated, Ross described the new immigrants like this. They are ox-like people who clearly belong in skins, in wattled huts at the close of the Great Ice Age. America, he believed, needed an uncompromising attitude toward these lower races. Otherwise, he concluded, America deserves the extinction that surely awaits it. And to characterize this latter concept, the threat of extinction, Ross coined a term that galvanized the anti-immigration movement in the first decade of the 20th century, race suicide. In that decade, it became a rallying cry among those convinced the nation would be destroyed by the immigrants generally, and specifically by their fecundity. The man who popularized Ross's term was Theodore Roosevelt, who believed that the failure of real American women to have 4 or more children would indeed lead to the racial suicide of those of what he called old American stock. Among those seeking to become new American stock, the nationalities that the anti-immigrationists most despised were the Italians and the Jews. This cartoon ran immediately after the assassination of President William McKinley in 1901. And if you see well, first the Italian flag colors are visible. There's a fellow over here, it says Mafia on it, knife in his throat. Rats coming from this ship. And this was published in Judge, which is an extremely respectable publication of the period. The antipathy to the Italians, by which I mean in this context specifically Southern Italians, was almost entirely class-based. The only Southern Italians they would likely ever encounter in Boston, say, of the 1890s, were fruit salesmen or laborers or bootblacks. But their dislike of Jews was something that appeared to have been delivered in their mother's milk. The stranger at our gate, emigrant saying, "Can I come in?" Uncle Sam says, "I suppose you can. There's no law to keep you out." If you can't read it, Sabbath desecration, poverty, and disease are spelled out on his clothing. And of course, the caricature is truly astonishing. This was another history of the United States. The white man chases away the American native, and he's standing proud, and then comes this Eastern European Jew to push him into the abyss, comparing the two. Isaac Mayer Wise's disdain for the Eastern European Jews notwithstanding, to the aristocratic class of old American stock, even the wealthiest, most cultured, and most thoroughly assimilated German Jews were suspect. Consider these quotations from 2 letters by a young woman of fine upbringing and education written to her mother-in-law. She had just met, she wrote in the first letter, an interesting man but very Jew. In the second, she said she would rather be hung than attend another Jew party and hear all this talk of money, jewels, and sables. The writer of those letters was Eleanor Roosevelt at age 32. If even this paragon of tolerance, she obviously went through some enormous changes in the years ahead, if even she felt this way, it's easier to grasp just how inbred these attitudes were. The man she had described as very Jew, incidentally, was Harvard Law professor Felix Frankfurter, whom her husband, Franklin, would later name to the Supreme Court. In such an environment, with immigration numbers increasing annually, more than 1 million people came through Ellis Island in 1907 alone, it was not hard for Henry Cabot Lodge and his allies to keep the literacy test on tap. 4 more times it was introduced and passed one house only to die in the other, until 1912 when Lodge finally assembled the votes in both House and Senate to pass it. But, almost like Grover Cleveland waiting until the last day of his term to veto the original version, William Howard Taft, who still had 2.5 weeks left in his presidency, also vetoed the revived Lodge literacy test. 2 years later, it passed Congress again, with even larger majorities. The president now was Woodrow Wilson. In 1902, before he entered politics, Wilson, a history professor, had written this: "The sturdy stocks of Northern Europe," white Protestant, "were now imperiled by multitudes of men of the lowest class from the south of Italy, and men of the meaner sort out of Hungary and Poland, men out of the ranks where there was neither skill, nor energy, nor any initiative of quick intelligence." Elsewhere, he had written about the corruption of foreign blood. But Wilson was now a politician, not a professor, and his party depended a great deal on ethnic votes from the large cities that had been filling with immigrants. Once again, the literacy test was vetoed. But Lodge, who said he never hated a man as much as he hated Woodrow Wilson, Lodge did not despair. He did show an astute sense of an alliance that would soon change everything when he wrote, "Darwin and Galton have lived and written. Mendel has been discovered and revived, and the modern biologists have supervened." We know Darwin and Mendel, of course, but who was Francis Galton? Among other things, he was Charles Darwin's first cousin. He was immensely wealthy, and he used his wealth to finance one of the most singular of Victorian lives in England of the 19th century. The living definition of a gentleman scientist, he sponsored and led expeditions to unexplored territories. He was the first to discover the movement of anticyclones. He devised the statistical law of regression to the mean, and he established the individuality and utility of fingerprints. He also invented and named the science of eugenics. The core of the eugenic idea was fairly simple. If a man and a woman of similar traits marry, their offspring will more than likely share some of the same traits. But the practice of eugenics took that truism several steps further. First, Galton argued that it was in the national interest that the mating of exceptional individuals be arranged by the state. He went so far as to propose that a national study would identify inherently superior individuals and incentivize them with £1,000 per couple then to marry in a mass wedding in Westminster Abbey presided over by Queen Victoria. Then they would presumably get down to their assigned business, fulfilling their patriotic responsibilities by making superior babies for the benefit of Great Britain. Excuse me. Inevitably, though, Galton would come to see the obverse of the coin he had minted. This became clear a few years later when he advocated denying the undesirable classes the liberty of propagating children. At the end of the 19th century, eugenics leapt across the ocean. It took firmest root in the laboratories of an American zoologist who, on his way home from a bivalve hunting expedition in Northern Europe, had made a pilgrimage to Galton's London home. To Charles Benedict Davenport, the principles of eugenics were apparent and seductive. His specialty had been the study of poultry, and in various breeding experiments, he had seen how traits had been passed along, logically enough, we see this in our own lives, from generation to generation. Why wouldn't the same principles apply to humans? In 1910, he established the Eugenic Record Office on Long Island. It was one of the first offspring of the world-renowned scientific juggernaut today known as Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, a child that, in time, the mature institution would thoroughly disown. The Record Office's goal was to gather information, genetic, characterological, moral, name it, on as many Americans as possible, draw conclusions on the individual's relative merit, and encourage promising matings. It was funded by this woman, Mary W. Harriman, the wife of the railroad tycoon E.H. Harriman. When E.H. died in 1909, his widow, now the richest woman in America, decided to dedicate her life and her fortune to philanthropy. She said she had three goals: to help the unfortunate ones, to ensure the equal opportunity for all to become efficient, and, ominously, to prevent the decay of the American race. Davenport's goal was to send investigators, a generous term, across the country to gather the data that would fill the thousands of files in his underground vault. These investigators were largely undergraduate or recently graduated women from fine Eastern colleges. Few had any training beyond what they had gleaned on the law of Davenport's installation in Cold Spring Harbor. Their primary instructor and the manager of the project was Harry H. Laughlin, the man smiling in back there. Laughlin was previously an agriculture instructor at a small college in northeastern Missouri. He didn't have a graduate degree. He had no training at all in genetics, but he was efficient and he was enthusiastic. Remember his name. He'll be showing up again in a few minutes. Now, this is the kind of material they gathered. This was a form that was created that the investigator, these young women from Eastern colleges, would interview people and learn everything about them, about the way that they live and what their relations were and so on. And then it was all compiled in something called the Trait Book. And this was among the 4,000 traits that were identified by these investigators. You see some of them up there. I mean, forehead, peculiar hairiness of, or forgery, freckling, funnel-breasted, ability in geology, and they presumed that this was all genetic. This research, and I can't make the air quotes vivid enough for that one, would form the basis of the radical change in U.S. immigration policy that lay ahead and that Henry Cabot Lodge had sensed was on its way. This is the man who set it in motion. Madison Grant was a New Yorker of vast wealth and equally substantial enthusiasms. He was a hunter of big game, a connoisseur of wildlife, and though an amateur, a truly important figure in 20th century applied natural science. For one thing, he founded the Bronx Zoo. For another, he almost single-handedly saved the redwood forests of Northern California. Some have made the case that he was the nation's most important environmentalist, long before environmentalism had captured the public's attention. For a third, he was a racist and anti-Semite and anti-Catholic of rabid intensity, with time and money to use in the effort to purify, a term he used frequently, his country. This is what he did. Whereas both Galton and Davenport had devoted themselves to the promotion of salubrious marriages and the concomitant suppression of those they considered dysgenic, the opposite of eugenic, Grant, without any training at all, applied their principles not to individuals or couples, but to entire nationalities. In 1916, he published The Passing of the Great Race, a fever dream of a book filled with the appearance of scholarship, but the substance of an exhausted dandelion blossom. Invoking all of human ethnic history, or I should say his version of human ethnic history, Grant hit upon a few core ideas. First, there were three distinct European races. First, the Nordics, whom he described as a race of soldiers, sailors, adventurers, and explorers, but above all of rulers, organizers, and aristocrats. Next were the Alpines. Those would be the French, Swiss, the middle of Europe. They were a step below the Nordics. Then beneath them, Italians, Spaniards, Greeks, the Mediterraneans, the lowest. Then, adapting eugenic theory not to individuals but to nations, Grant asserted it was now well-established science that in the match of the member of one racial group with another, the children will revert to the lower group. Thus, any marriage between a Nordic and an Alpine would therefore produce an alpine. Any marriage between an alpine and a Mediterranean would therefore produce a Mediterranean. And he concluded, quote, the marriage of any of the three European races to a Jew would produce a Jew. The holy political marriage arranged by Grant wed the bilious xenophobia of anti-immigrationists to the intellectual fraud that underlay the eugenic faith. Less than a year after the first edition of Grant's book was published, the first of 4 editions over the next 7 years, Congress once again enacted Lodge's literacy test, the wall that would keep people out. You're welcome in, says Uncle Sam, if you can climb it. Once again, Woodrow Wilson vetoed the literacy test, but this time his veto was overridden. The literacy test was embedded in the law of the land, and to charges that it was a thin disguise for errant prejudice, the anti-immigrationists responded, no, it's science. Soon, the doctrine that many years later would come to be labeled scientific racism began to permeate the culture. This advertisement in a magazine, I don't know how well you can read it, but the American woman is rapidly becoming ugly. Professor Ross has proved it. When the low immigrant is giving us 3 babes, while the daughter of the revolution is giving us 1, it means that we're vanishing. Around the same time, psychologists who administered a preposterous intelligence test to more than 1 million Army recruits at the time of World War I claimed to have proven that Eastern and Southern Europeans were of lower intelligence. Here's a sample question, multiple choice. Bud Fisher is famous as an actor, an author, a baseball player, or a comic book artist. Well, if your family had arrived in the U.S. 5 or 10 years earlier, not speaking any English, your failure to answer questions like this correctly apparently proved your deficient intelligence. Ethnically charged invocations of eugenics were intensified by the growing radicalism that provoked the so-called Red Raids of 1919 and 1920. The New York Times, then as now, owned by a prominent German Jewish family, ran an editorial insisting that the need of restriction is manifest. American institutions are menaced by swarms of aliens who are bringing to our shores the diseases of ignorance and Bolshevism. Need of restriction, even after the enactment of the literacy test? Well, the anti-immigrationists had quickly discovered that in the more than 2 decades since Lodge had introduced the literacy test in Congress, education levels in the suspect countries had advanced substantially. The test was not keeping enough people out. One of the founders of the Immigration Restriction League explained that the test, while improving the quality of immigration, is likely to diminish in value as a means of restriction. The people who are coming are better, but they're still not good enough. In 1920, the number of immigrants rose to levels not seen since the onset of the World War. The following year, 3 events accelerated and intensified the movement for increased restriction. In New York, the American Museum of Natural History played host to an international conference of eugenicists that brought true believers from Asia, Europe, and South America. In addition to Madison Grant and Mary Harriman, financial sponsors included Alexander Graham Bell, J.H. Kellogg, and the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover. The conference was presided over by the longtime director of the museum, H. Fairfield Osborne, front center. These were some of the other people who attended the conference behind him. Osborne, who happened to be Madison Grant's very closest friend, was a racist of comparable intensity. Grant himself was one of the conference managers, as was Harry Laughlin of the Eugenic Record Office in Cold Spring Harbor. Front pages across America reported on the conference's proceedings and its findings, which were exactly as you might expect. What you might not have expected was Osborne, a world-renowned paleontologist and the longtime leader of one of the nation's premier scientific institutions, saying anything like this, explaining away the possibility of greatness coming from the so-called lesser races. Osborne actually said, Columbus, from his portraits and his busts, authentic or not, was clearly of Nordic ancestry. Authentic or not. These pictures are not real, but they prove that this Italian was Nordic. Think about that for a moment. It is harder to imagine a more obvious corruption of scientific inquiry. The second event in that fateful year was engineered by this man, Albert Johnson, congressman from Washington State and chairman of the House Immigration Committee. He conceived the Emergency Immigration Act of 1921, a measure that for 2 years would install the first quota ever on the total number of immigrants allowed into the U.S., 3% of what it had been before. Johnson appointed Laughlin, yes, him again, the Immigration Committee's official expert eugenics agent, and Laughlin fired up the members with several days of testimony, in which, accompanied by a dazzling array of charts and maps, he unspooled a series of assertions concerning the deficient physical, mental, and moral qualities of immigrants. The character of a nation is determined primarily by its racial qualities, Laughlin said. Thus certified by Johnson's so-called expert, the bill passed both houses of Congress easily, and was agreeably signed into law by the new president, Warren G. Harding. During debate on the House floor, Johnson had said, "We do not want Japanese, Chinese, Hindu, Turk, Greek, Italian, or any other nationality until we can clean house." These scary words. In that day's congressional record, the stenographers added one word in brackets, in capitals, at the conclusion of Johnson's speech. The word was applause. But perhaps even more fateful, even more indicative of the rush in 1921 toward intensified restriction was an article published in All Places, Good Housekeeping magazine. It read in part, "It would be suicidal for us to let down the bars for the inflowing of cheap manhood. There are racial considerations too grave to be brushed aside for any sentimental reasons. Biological laws tell us that certain divergent people will not mix or blend." The author of that article was the new vice president, Calvin Coolidge. 2 years later, as president, he would amplify this point in his very first message to Congress, declaiming a 3-word phrase that resonates through the decades: America for Americans. And thus did the Immigration Act of 1924, one of the century's most deplorable and effective pieces of legislation, come into being. Here's how it worked. First, it cut the 1921 overall quota in half to a total of 160,000 immigrants per year. As recently as 1920, more than 222,000 had come from Italy alone. Second, it established quotas by nation. This is slightly complicated, but I think it's worth knowing. If, say, 10% of Americans could trace their origins to country X, then 10% of all new immigrants, 160,000 new immigrants, that means 16,000 of them, could come from country X. But both the genius of the legislation and the giveaway of its discriminatory intent was the third key element. One would think that in 1924, the 1920 census would be the obvious source to determine the ancestral heritage of Americans, and thus the country-by-country allocations. But no, Johnson and his colleagues thought that wouldn't do quite what they wanted the quota to do. So they went back, not to the 1910 census, not to the 1900 census, but all the way to 1890. This was the last census before the explosion of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. The last census, in other words, that showed what America had once been. And most brilliant and diabolical of all, the entire act, all 38 sections of it, over 30 pages, did not contain the name of a single nation or a single ethnic group. It was simply a matter of math. Thus, from the lands comprising most of the Russian Empire, including Poland and Lithuania, there had been 190,000 arrivals in the last pre-quota year, slightly more than half of them Jewish. Under the new quota, their number was slashed to 7,000. For Italy, it was even worse. While 1920 had seen 220,000 Italians pass through the door, the new number was slashed to a bare 2,662. Among citizens of all the European countries, though, the Greeks were the most severely restricted. Italians, Jews, Poles, and others had been coming into the U.S., albeit in relatively small numbers, since the 1840s. But emigration from Greece really didn't begin until the early part of the 20th century as the conflict between Turkey and Greece intensified. The Greek presence in the 1890 census had been microscopic. Thus, too, was the 1924 quota, 100 Greeks a year. New York Times, the melting pot comes to an end. The 1924 Immigration Act altered the complexion of our nation. Henry Curran, the immigration commissioner presiding over Ellis Island, boasted to visitors in 1925 that things had changed there. Now, there is not one immigrant in 1,000 who does not dress, walk, and generally look like an American. Emboldened by the additional credibility the 1924 Act had implicitly granted them, America's eugenicists reached yet further. State fairs across the country featured booths, exhibits, and programs designed to inform, inspire the middle American public. This sign contained a typical admonition. How long are we Americans to be so careful for the pedigree of our chicken and cattle and then leave the ancestry of our children to chance or blind sentiment? In 1927, in the landmark case Buck v. Bell, an 8-1 majority of the Supreme Court found that a Virginia law authorizing compulsory sterilization of deficient individuals residing in state institutions was constitutional. The author of the Virginia law, meant to be, and it became, a model for other states, was Harry Laughlin. Throughout the 1920s and as late as 1932, American eugenicists extended their international collaboration to like-minded scientists and politicians in many other countries. One of those, of course, was Germany. In fact, Charles Davenport's relationship with some very reputable German scientists dated all the way back to 1906. But some of these reputable scientists turned a different direction with the rise of Nazism. One such was Eugen Fischer. Before the Nazis, he was an internationally respected anthropologist. Later, as rector of the University of Berlin, he won the respect of Adolf Hitler. In Mein Kampf, incidentally, Hitler's jailhouse book, maybe not so incidentally, Hitler had specifically cited the U.S. as the one country whose laws dealt most effectively with unwanted immigration. Around the same time that Fisher was managing the purge of Jewish faculty members at the university, he said this: what Darwin was not able to, genetics has achieved. It has destroyed the theory of the equality of man. In due time, German eugenicists would become instrumental contributors to Nazi atrocities conducted under the aegis of scientific experimentation. One such was Karl Brandt, the man in the middle here. He was Hitler's personal physician, a member of the SS who rose to become the Third Reich's Commissioner of Health and Sanitation, and as such, he oversaw much of the medical experimentation, much of it torture, in the concentration camps. At the post-war doctors' trials in Nuremberg, where Brandt and several other physicians were charged with crimes against humanity, Brandt cited Buck v. Bell in his defense. How could what he had done be considered illegal when the U.S. Supreme Court itself had approved something very similar? Co-defendants similarly invoked Madison Grant's book, The Passing of the Great Race, and the 1924 Immigration Act itself. These men didn't say they were following orders in the self-exonerating language of the moment. They said they were following Americans. We're almost there. By 1946, most of the Americans they had followed had abandoned the discipline they had championed for so long. Hitlerism had led private foundations that had financed eugenics study to withdraw their support. Institutions such as the American Museum of Natural History and the Carnegie Institution of Washington dissolved their connections to eugenicists. Many of the scientists and their supporters acknowledged their errors, including Edward A. Ross, the man who coined the idea of race suicide. Ross apologized for promoting what he now called the fallacy of rating peoples according to the grade of their culture. He added, "Far behind me in the ditch lies the Nordic myth." But not all of the scientists apologized. In 1936, Harry Laughlin accepted an honorary degree from the University of Heidelberg at the very time that it had purged its entire Jewish faculty, in tribute to his role, the citation said, as the far-seeing representative of racial policy in America. Aspects of that policy finally began to crumble in the 1950s. Remember, this law was put in place in 1924, when the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe had, in the American mind, transformed the inhabitants of those countries from pariahs to the imprisoned citizens of so-called captive nations. The civil rights movement of the 1960s also hovered over the regard of Americans toward those unlike themselves. Then, in 1965, Lyndon Johnson, in a ceremony conducted on Liberty Island in New York Harbor, signed into law the Hart-Celler Act, which effectively revoked the 1924 Immigration Act and permanently disabled the system of national quotas that had been in place for 41 years. The lineup of people, there are a lot of politicians you're probably not familiar with, people my generation know well, but you see it on the far right, it's Bobby Kennedy and Teddy Kennedy. They're second and third from the right, Hubert Humphrey and many others. The last sentence of my book is a comment on that signing ceremony. It reads, for believers, I guess I should do this too. For believers in the promise of the nearby statue, the future of American immigration policy looked as bright as the brilliant sun overhead. Of course, given the political tumult of our times, I was being ironic when I wrote that. But maybe irony is inappropriate at a time when the nation, as I was writing, was still excluding residents of several Muslim countries, or when the then president had dismissed other nations as shitholes, or had tried to staunch the immigration from Mexico and Central America because it was from Mexico and Central America. And today, the anti-immigration cause, largely directed at people of certain suspect ethnicities, has once again emerged as a central issue in American politics. I don't want to suggest that such ethnic and religious discrimination will result years ahead in anything like the Holocaust, which cost the lives of at least several 100,000 people unable to emigrate to the U.S. between 1924 and 1945. But judgments based on ethnicity, nationality, and religion, I'm afraid, are very much in the American grain. At the same time, they defy Abraham Lincoln's appeal to the better angels of our nature. While recognizing the enormity of the crisis at our southern border and figuring out how it can possibly be dealt with in a fashion that is both effective and humane, let's hope that Lincoln's sentiment prevails. Thank you. Thank you very much. We are open for questions. I am open for questions. If you would come to the mic, if you have one, that's to enable the recording of this session to be intelligible.
How did the Groton School affect immigration?
I'm sorry?
How did the Groton School affect immigration?
The Groton School, did you say?
Yeah. Endicott Peabody, he had all those boys,
Oh,
Roosevelt.
no. I mean, there's no question that the very high-end Protestant, St. Mark's, Middlesex, Groton, Choate, they were totally discriminatory institutions in this period, and people were raised, these young men were raised to the faith that had been theirs for, and I don't mean their religious faith, but their faith in themselves and in their belief in what America was, from the cradle.
But so many politicians of that generation came out of those schools.
Yeah, they came out, and some of them were really awful, and then some of them were quite good. And you see, the Franklin Roosevelt, who actually, his immigration record isn't perfect by any means, but he came out. So.
I mean, when you look at it, now the movie Oppenheimer's out. Who provided the information for the atomic bomb, right?
Yeah.
And who made it? And wasn't Goebbels also a chicken farmer?
I think he was.
Yes.
I think he was.
And do you have any idea of how many Chinese bodies are in Lake Tahoe?
No, I do not. But thank you for bringing it up. Okay. Anyone else? There's one question that I usually get, and I'm very surprised I'm not getting today, that I'm going to ask myself a question. Well, what about the Irish? You hardly mentioned them after 1846 and the potato famine. Well, it's an interesting thing. Henry Cabot Lodge, being a Massachusetts politician, runs for office for the first time in the 1880s, by which time the Irish had votes. So the Irish were white by his standard, and were saved the discrimination that they had faced in coming to the country in the 1840s. The fact of who has the vote, that's also what led Woodward Wilson to change his politics from anti-immigration to pro-immigration as the parties began to divide on ethnic lines. The other thing I should say about the Irish, if you know your Irish history, they were British. You know, Ireland was part of the UK, and so they came in under the same quota, which I should also, I'll shut up in a minute, the German quota and the British quota were almost never filled. There were times when there was still room for 6,000 more Germans, 11,000 more Britons, but were those numbers assigned to Italians and Greeks? No, didn't happen.
Thank you for such an interesting presentation on such an important topic. I wonder if you can comment on the interaction between what we're usually taught about the Darwinian theory of survival of the fittest, and here's a theory on the opposite side, essentially, of survival of the least fit. And you know, so two different scientific ideologies in conflict. When we talk about how one became more prominent or less prominent, whether among...
It's interesting because, as I said, Galton was Darwin's first cousin, but his theory was very much anti-Darwinian. He claimed to be a supporter of Darwin, as many of these scientists did, but as you said, it wasn't survival of the fittest. They were maintaining that it was the least fit who were going to overwhelm the fit. So they turned the science, or the so-called science, to suit themselves. Not the first time that's ever happened.
I was thinking when you talk about the Irish and even before, there's a whole conversation here about different races that, from a certain vantage point, if you're younger, is sort of surprising, who and what counts as race. And you look at the construction of race all over this time. So you've got a parallel story there of people, lots of people becoming white and shifting. How did these figures play into that story? So rather than just Jews as a different race and Italians and Greeks as a different race, the whole movement into...
Well, it's an amazing thing called citizenship. Citizenship and getting the franchise, getting the vote, suddenly elevates people who didn't have it before into at least a level playing field. A level playing field. Now, not entirely, obviously. Where was the money? Who were the people who were controlling various institutions? But it was at least the illusion of a level playing field. He's an American. She's an American. They've been here long enough. And they became white. That, in fact, is a term that was used, you know, in the era, in the 1910s and 1920s. Or another one was, he gets whiter every day, was said about one particular politician. We don't escape these things. As I've said several times in my talk, these issues are always with us. And I'm just going to reiterate that what I said about making your distinctions on the quality of an immigrant based on his or her ethnicity is something that I think is just, it can't be supported by anybody without considering that person a racist. That's what racism is. That's determining that because not who you are, not the content of your character, but the content of all the characters in the country you come from, it's unabidable.
Thanks for a really interesting talk. One of the things that the length of the history of this issue that you found kind of speaks to, I think, is how easy it is to get people to buy into the idea that different can mean, different from us means potentially inferior to us. Otherwise, people wouldn't keep using it as campaign fodder and trumpeting it. Does your review of the history find any good ways of combating that way of thinking?
Well, in nearly every case, when the sine wave dips down and is welcoming to people from abroad, it's because of the economy. It's because of the employment market. And right now, the President Biden just yesterday announced that 500,000 Venezuelans in the country are going to be allowed to work legally. He couldn't possibly say that if there were not a severe labor shortage in many parts of the country. But the employers have always been pro-immigration in the agriculture and industrial fields. Lower wages. They're going to bring in lower wages. And the labor unions have generally been against it. But does that mean that this phase we're in now will end soon? I wouldn't dare suggest that. I mean, we do have, our policies are, they're just awful right now. It's not working. And I think it's, I don't want to suggest that I think we should open the doors and let everybody in. Just don't keep people out because of where they're from and what they believe. Anyone else? Well, thank you for giving me an hour of your time. I appreciated it.